Okay, chapter 34 and 35. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he could walk for no more than an hour, maybe two, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see that there was nothing ahead of him, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, and most of all, thirsty. Maybe he should just turn around now. Maybe he had already gone halfway and didn't know it. Then, looking around, he saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened them again to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pool was still there. He hurried towards it. The pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping as he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering waves of heat rising off of the dry ground. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if he might find something to put in it. And after a while, he thought he could make it the shape of a mountain through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if it was another kind of mirage, but the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. Although almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist and a thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain. It was more than halfway. He kept walking towards it, although he didn't know why. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there. Every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, like giving him a thumbs-up sign. As he continued walking, he became aware of a large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if there was a natural or man-made. It looked like something like a fallen tree, although it didn't seem like there would be a tree would grow out here. More likely a ridge or dirt or rocks. The object, whatever it was not on the way to Big Thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or continue to Big Thumb, or maybe just turn around. There's no point in heading towards Big Thumb, he decided. He would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to the mysterious object. He changed directions. He doubted it was anything, but the fact that there was something in the middle of all of this, nothing, made it hard for him to pass up. He decided to make the object his halfway point. He hoped he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed at himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or at least part of a boat anyways. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of a dry, barren wasteland. But after all, he realized it once was a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Someone may have drowned there, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he would very well die of thirst. The name of the boat was painted on the back. Upside down, red letters peeled off and faded. Stanley could read the name, Mary Lou. On one side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt, and then a tunnel leading down below the boat. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a voice, something stirring under the boat. It was coming out. "Hey!" Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was dry and hard to shout very loudly. "Hey!" the thing answered weakly. Then a dark hand in an orange sleeve reached out from the tunnel. Chapter 35. Zero's face, looking like a jack-o'-lantern, had just left out too many days after Halloween. Half-rotten, half-sunken eyes and a droopy smile. "That water?" he asked. His voice was weak and graspy. His lips were pale, almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop out uselessly from his mouth as he spoke, as it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not quite believing that he was real. "I tried to bring you a whole water truck, but," said sheepishly, "I drove it into a hole." "I can't believe you're—" "Me either," said Zero. "Come on, let's get you back to camp." Zero shook his head. "I ain't going back." "You have to. We both have to." "Want some sploosh?" Zero asked. "What?" Zero shaded his eyes with his forehead. It was cooler under the boat. Stanley watched Zero crawl back into his hole. It was a miracle he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get him back to the camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him and just able to squeeze his body through the hole. He would have never fit in that hole the first week of Camp Green Lake. He had lost a lot of weight. As he pulled himself through, his legs stuck to something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. For a second, Stanley wondered how it got there. Then he remembered Zero had taken it after striking Mr. Pendensky. It was cooler under the boat, but was half buried in the dirt. There's enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat. Now the roof to provide light and through the roof to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero handed him a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. What is it? Sploosh! His voice was strained as he worked for the jar. That's what I call it. They were buried underneath the boat. He still couldn't get the lid off. Found 16 jars. Here, hand me the shovel. Stanley didn't have a lot of room to move. He reached behind him, grabbed a wooden end of the shovel, and held it out to Zero, blade first. Something you just have to, Stanley said as he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the lid of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh off the ragged edge that had spilled. Careful, Stanley said. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off that as well. They handed the broken jar to Stanley. Drink some. Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized, it must have been in the boat when the boat sank, which means it's probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in it? It's good, said Zero, encouraging him. He wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy nectar, sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven had flown into his dry mouth, down on his parched throat. He thought that maybe it was some kind of fruit at some point, perhaps peaches. Zero smiled at him. I told you it was good. Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. How many are left? He asked. None, said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. Now I have to take you back, he said. I'm not digging any more holes, said Zero. They won't make you dig, Stanley said. They'll probably send you to the hospital like Barf Bag. Barf Bag stepped on a rattlesnake, said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. I guess he didn't hear the rattle. He did it on purpose, said Zero. You think? He took off his shoe and sock first. Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it. You think Marialuoya? What's Marialuoya? Said Zero. What? Zero concentrated hard. Marialuoya. I have no idea. I'll show you, said Zero. He crawled back out from underneath the tent. Stanley followed, back outside, and shielded his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around the boat and pointed to the upside down letters. Mary-Lou-O. Stanley smiled. Mary Lou, it's the name of the boat. Mary Lou, Zero repeated, studying the letters. I thought Y made a sound. It does, said Stanley, but when it's at the end of the word, sometimes Y is a vowel and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. You all right? Zero dropped to the ground. He laid on his side, his knees up to his chest, and continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was the sploosh. He looked back at the Camp Green Lake. At least he thought in the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure. Zero stopped moaning. His body slowly unbent. I'll take you back, said Stanley. Zero managed to sit up. He took several deep breaths. Look, I got a plan, so you won't get in trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember I gave it to X-Ray and the warden went crazy making us dig when she thought X-Ray found it? I think I could tell the warden that I really found it. She let us off. I'm not going back, said Zero. You got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He'd come to rescue Zero, and instead he drank the last of his splush. He looked off in the distance. I want you to look at something. I'm not. I just want you to look at the mountain up there. See the one thing that has something sticking out of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing. And then they studied the mountain. His right hand slowly formed a fist, and he raised his thumb. His eyes went to the mountain, in his hands, and then back to the mountain.